Okay, can you all hear me okay? You can all hear me okay? Okay, great. So y'all had a good lunch, right? Awesome. This is the first time I've ever been given an entire hour to speak, so I'm just gonna luxuriate in this for just a second. Enjoy the time I have, so I'm gonna resist the 3 cups of coffee I've had today and speak slow because I have the time. So, hi. It's great to be back in Boston. I lived here for 5 years once. I went to BU. I've given some other BU people here. Who's from BU? Sweet. Oh, right, Liza, of course. Go Terriers, yay. So basically, who am I? Who is this guy you're listening to? I am a native New Yorker. Yay, all right. I love this crowd. Aside from the 5 years in Boston, I lived in New York most of my life. Not always in the city, but for most of it. Before I got into game development, I was a 9-to-5 guy. I worked in the Garment Center in New York, very boring. Escaped all that and started Wadjet Eye Games in 2006. Made a bunch of games by myself and joined by my wife Janet in 2009. Later, my daughter Eve in 2013. Thank you. She has yet to start coding, but she does give me a lot of criticism. We have launched 16 games. I don't know if you've heard any of them. We're known for the Blackwell series, Puzzlebots, Shiva, Resonance, Primordia, Gemini Rue, Golden Wake, Shardlight, New Guys, Emerald City Confidential, and Techno Babylon. And most recently, Unavowed, which came out last year. I'm also wearing it. So here again is my really pretentious talk title, which makes this sound more mechanical than it really is. I'm here to talk about empathy, which means discussing feelings. And that is a very arcane, nebulous thing that is very hard to quantify. There are no hard and fast rules about how you feel about stuff. So a lot of this talk is going to be about my own thought processes and experiences about the subject. Kind of how my own experiences dealing with my own creations and own characters and things like that. So I'll be talking about myself a lot, just to warn you. So I started thinking about this whole character empathy thing in a major way about 4 years ago. I was working on a game called Techno Babylon with a man named James Dearden. And I'm going to be talking about a sequence from the game, but don't worry if you haven't played it. No spoilers, because this sequence was cut, and I'm going to tell you why. There was a scene and set of puzzles at the very beginning of the game. This is the first time you're introduced to one of the player characters. The guy in blue, his name is Charles Regis. He is a kind of future cyberpunk cop. You enter this room to find this teenage girl sitting on the tree branch, and she is threatening to hang herself. And you talk to her for a bit, and she hangs herself. And that kicks off a sequence where you need to save her and get her down before she dies. And in theory, this had a lot of stuff to it. It had drama, it had tension, it had high stakes, but for some reason, and I apologize for this next graphic, it fell very flat. Sorry. I couldn't find a way to represent that visually, but there we go. Nobody really cared, and even I didn't really care much when playing the sequence. The scene did not resonate very well at all. And as more and more testers played through it, we learned most of them felt the same way. And much later than we should have, we finally took a close look at the scene and tried to figure out just why. Why did no one care? Why didn't I care? And the answer is kind of obvious, as most of these things are. We didn't know either of these people. We didn't know her. We didn't know her struggle. She says something about it being a political statement, but we don't know enough about the world yet for that to have any real meaning. We don't know anything about Regis, the character we're playing. We're asking the player to care about many things and care very deeply on pure blind faith. We are assuming a level of empathy where none really existed. and that's why the sequence didn't really work at all. I know Scott Adams is kind of a jerk, but I still love this character. As a result, I committed my biggest act of executive meddling, and I asked James to remove the scene completely and replace it with something else. And I'm going to talk about that a bit later. Excuse me. This experience taught me a lot, and ever since I've been thinking about empathy and caring ever since, because too often a game is more focused on just telling you what is happening and rarely puts the effort in to get you to actually care about what is happening. And I want to care. I've played a lot of games and I've seen it all. It's very hard to get me to care, but I want to so badly. As like you go to a movie, you want to be taken out of yourself. Same thing with a game. You don't want a game to be a chore. You want to be taken out of yourself. You want to care. And I want to take a step back and talk about a term that I made up, which I coined a few years ago and has not caught on, but now we're being videoed, so maybe that'll change. I call it having your dinner. And this refers to a scene in the TV show Breaking Bad. How many of you have watched Breaking Bad? A lot of you. Okay, and don't worry if you haven't. I'm actually talking to the people who haven't. But if you have watched the show, you probably know which scene having your dinner refers to. It's this one. The scene where Walter White brings Jesse Pinkman home for dinner. The scene is great. It's funny, it's awkward as hell, and very dramatic all at the same time. And I'm not alone in thinking this. Tons of articles and essays have been written about it, all analyzing the shots and the timing and the pacing and everything. Don't worry if you can't concentrate on reading it. It's going up on YouTube later, so you can pause it and read it. But I'm not interested in any of that stuff. What interests me most about this scene is if you're watching it out of context, you have no idea what's going on. For those of you who have not seen this show, if you look at this dialogue and you probably don't know what the big deal is. None of it makes any sense. But if you did watch it, you know exactly what the big deal is and why this little animation is so very, very funny. And when I sit and think about the scene now, all I can think is, wow, this took balls to write. What a leap of faith that must have taken. This dinner scene only works if your audience has been deeply invested in the story and the characters thus far. And the writer, Vince Gilligan, had the guts, the sheer chutzpah, to believe that the audience cared enough about his characters to make a scene like this work. This scene takes place in the 6th episode of the 5th season of Breaking Bad. So every line, every moment, every action of this scene is seeped in 5.5 seasons worth of context, worth of stuff. That's 5 years, 54 episodes, and 40 hours of character development and plot advancement, all of which are needed to get this scene and be affected by it. He is assuming a level of empathy that actually is there. So that is the background behind my term, having your dinner, which I loosely define as the point at which the audience's emotional investment is assumed. If you have your dinner on time, it can pay off beautifully. Have your dinner too early, it falls flat. Have it too late, things start feeling padded. This metaphor is a little strained. I just really like Breaking Bad. So going back to Technobabylon, we tried to have our dinner so early that it was practically breakfast, really. Excuse me. There was no emotional investment here. And James told me that when he originally wrote this suicide scene, he was still getting a feel for the world and the characters and everything around it. And it was fairly obvious when you played it. There's not only a lack of connection between the player and the sequence, but there's also, whoops, crap, what did I do? What did I do? Sorry. There was not only a lack of connection between the player and the sequence, but there was also a lack of connection between the writer and the sequence, and that was very, very palpable. The player didn't feel that lack of empathy, or rather, didn't feel the empathy at all. But here's the interesting thing. When I asked James to cut the scene, he had already written most of the game, which means he had spent several years immersed in this world, growing very familiar with it and its characters. And it's obvious that towards the end, he really began to care about them and care very deeply. The later scenes in the game show a tremendous amount of care and detail. So when I asked him to write a new scene from the beginning, he was able, a new scene for the beginning rather, he was able to approach it from this whole new mental place. And it was like night and day. This is a shot from that new sequence. I will not spoil it for you, but this replaced the suicide scene. It's short, it's simple, it's 10 times more effective. It again casts you as Regis, and you get a sense of him and his partner, Max Lau, almost instantly. They say a few lines with each other and you feel it. Bam, you know who they are. You get a feeling for the world, what they're up against, what the game is even kind of about within 20 minutes, 10, 20 minutes, very quickly. And James was only able to do that because he had such a close understanding of the world he had created. And as a result, he developed a very keen and deep connection that could not be faked. And I could think of several examples of this. This is nothing new. I could think of several examples off the top of my head. I mean, all of these things, you know, I always tell people, oh, the Dark Tower series is great. The first one's awful, just keep going. Babylon 5, same thing. The first season is very generic. It gets amazing. You know, Avatar starts off kind of childish. It turns into the most magnificent thing you'll ever see on television. Legends of Tomorrow, has anyone watched this show? The first season is awful. The rest of it is pure brilliance. I adore this show now. But like I said, this is expected. The creators and writers of these things are developing a connection to their world and the characters as they're going along, and that familiarity is very palpable. And you write what you know, and you write what you feel. And if you care, you have the best foundation in which to make your audience care as well. If you don't have a feeling or a sense of connection with what you're making, it will really have no heart and no soul. And I am not immune to this either. This same criticism is often leveled at my own work, specifically the Blackwell series. How many of you have played Blackwell, just out of curiosity? Wow! Oh, I love you guys. This is a great room. This is a series of 5 games that I spent almost a decade of my life writing. It was conceived even earlier than that, even before I started Wadjet Eye, before I started the company. It was around 2003. I was bored at work one day and decided, I want to make a game about a ghost. So I decided to just draw the ghost. So I summoned my years of art study, and I sat down and I drew a ghost. What? Anyway. And I named him Joey because why not? Nothing really substantial came of this idea. I mean, surprisingly. So I kind of just put him in my pocket for later use, research or whatever. And then years later, when I decided I wanted to sell games for a living, I took him out again and I created the Blackwell Legacy. This game starred 2 characters, Joey Malone, who's the ghost, and Rosa Blackwell, who is a spirit medium. And their deal is they help lost spirits come to terms with their death and help them move on. And this lasted 5 games. Legacy, Unbound, Convergence, Deception, and Epiphany. And creating them, as I said, took almost a decade of my life. And over that period of time, I became very intimately familiar with these 2 characters. So much so that when I revisit the first game, the characters are almost unrecognizable. Joey is bitter, kind of misogynistic and cruel in places. Rosa is so closed off and socially awkward that it was very hard to relate to her on any personal level. And also my skills as a designer were a lot weaker back then. I got better as I went on. And when the last game rolled around, I could write their dialogue in my sleep. I knew how they'd react to everything. And Natalia, who I think she left, but she touched on this yesterday in her keynote, where she said the more she works with her characters, the more real they felt. And that certainly was the case with me. I grew very emotionally attached to these two people. And I really, really cared about them. And like Vince Gilligan, and yes, I am totally comparing myself to the creator of Breaking Bad, because I really am that pretentious. Like Vince Gilligan, I totally took it. You guys are great. Like him, I totally took it for granted that, that at this point, the audience was already invested in these characters as much as I was. I could have my dinner, sweet. I could stop trying to give the audience feelings, and instead I could mess with them. And boy, that was so much fun. Natalia talked about this yesterday, that once you really get to know your characters, you can have fun with them, and that's where that's the juice there. That's why you get into this. That's why you do this. All those years of emotional investment, my own as well as the audience's, could now pay off. And as a creator, there's nothing like it. Tremendous sense of freedom when this happens. Not to mention relief. You know that you've achieved something, and now it can all pay off. So because I had such a good thing going, and because I had an existing audience that was emotionally invested in this world and these characters, and because life was apparently too easy and wonderful, I ended the series. And there are a number of reasons why I did that. The main reason is that regardless of how good each game was, it was still tethered to that first game, which by all metrics wasn't as good, sadly. I could no longer deny the player data, which showed a severe drop-off of players between the first game and the second one, and to a lesser degree the third. And by that point, the numbers stay pretty even for the rest of the series. So a lot of people played the first one, big drop-off, and then if they got to game 2 or 3, they usually continued on to the rest. And this was very dispiriting because it showed me that no matter how good a potential future Blackwell game could be, it would always be hampered. It would be tethered. It would be very difficult for me to reach a bigger audience. Any potential players who discover this new game would obviously go to the first one and probably bounce off of it and never experience the good ones. There were other reasons why I ended it as well. I was eager to try new things, and et cetera, et cetera. But the cold reality was that it was time to end it. And so I did. And it was very hard. As I said, I was very emotionally attached to these characters. So ending it was heart-wrenching. It was like, it was really difficult. And this kind of came to a head one day. It was several months after I had ended the series. I was in a cafe in Brooklyn, that's where I live, and it was a rainy day, it was winter, it was cold, and outside the window walked a woman wearing red hair, glasses, wearing a long black overcoat and earmuffs. She looked very familiar, and it was this really surreal moment. And I started tearing up and felt extraordinarily sad. It was this very weird, magical, surreal, sad, horrible thing that happened. But it really showed me that I had really connected to these characters on an emotional level very deeply, and I miss them. I still miss them. So now I was in this position where after all that emotional investment and build-up and all of that, I had to build all that up all over again for whatever I was doing next. Not just for the audience, but for myself. I learned at this point that it's very important to really care about what I'm doing, care about the characters that I create, liking and empathizing with the characters that I'm giving voice to. But unlike Blackwell, I didn't just want the game to get better as it went along, or get better later, or figure it out later. I didn't want to go through that again. I wanted to try to hit the ground running with characters that I already empathized with, because if I didn't care, you certainly weren't going to. So that brings us up to Unavowed. The quick elevator pitch is that it's an urban fantasy adventure game with the narrative structure of a party-based RPG, which is a boring and unsexy way of saying that the game was going to feel like a mid-era BioWare RPG, but without the combat. You progressed through the game via a series of missions, and for each mission, you had a pool of characters that join you on your adventure, and you could choose 2 of them to go with you at any given time. This mechanic is very familiar to anyone who played games like Knights of the Old Republic or Dragon Age or Mass Effect, but instead of changing your tactics and combat situations, they'd change how you solve puzzles and problems in the game world. I had some basic ideas. I knew it was going to be another urban fantasy set in New York, technically the same universe as Blackwell, but without all of Blackwell's baggage. So this was going to be its own separate thing with some little references for the old fans. I had to do that. So I had my setting, and I had bare bones ideas for characters. And with Blackwell, I had gotten to know, excuse me, getting ahead of myself. So these were the 4 characters that were going to be the ones that you palled around with over the course of the game. The draw and focus would be the relationships between them, teasing out their individual backstories, seeing them come together as a team over the course of the game. So in order to do that, I really needed to get into their heads and get to know them on a mental and emotional level. But whereas with Blackwell, as I said, that happened very organically and naturally over several years. And I obviously didn't want to wait that long. So I wanted to see if I could find another way to make that happen. Was there a systemic way I could reach that connection, kind of take a shortcut, if you will? Is there any way I can get there faster? So the first thing I did was I commissioned some sketches of the 4 characters. I only had a vague understanding of who they were, and I figured this would help me crystallize it a bit more. It wasn't quite as detailed and expressive as this, but, you know, they did the job. Sorry. Never get tired of looking at that guy. Since the game was focused on the characters, I again needed a really strong understanding of who they were and how they related to each other. So instead of putting them into the game and just trying to figure them out as I went along, I instead took the time I would normally spend doing that, and instead I would just write conversations between the characters, just as a writing exercise. Here is a brief example of something I came up with fairly quickly. I would come up with hypothetical situations and let them just kind of hash it out. For example, I just think, okay, these 2 characters are trapped on a roof and waiting for rescue. What do they talk about? Let them have a conversation. Or these 2 characters are contemplating the death of someone they are close to. What do they say? That kind of thing. The goal being to try to find the ways these characters connect with each other and what they have in common, what they don't have in common, what makes them laugh, what creates conflict, that kind of thing. Also, it helped create their backstories and flesh them out. As I was writing these conversations with each other, they would fill in the details that I normally would come up with over time, over the course of a series. And I noticed something very interesting when I started these exercises. The first place that I always went to, almost every single time, was snark. I found myself having them insult each other over and over again. And it amazed me how easy it was to fall into that, to just have the characters insult each other, and I would call that witty and funny. And I thought I was being so clever. And it wasn't until I looked over what I had written that I realized that I wasn't engaged with that at all. I wanted to like these people, and they weren't being terribly likable. So I changed tactics just a little bit. Here's the new one. If they're going to argue and disagree over something, that's fine. But at the end of the conversation, they need to meet somewhere in the middle and come to some kind of mutual understanding. Here, whereas, I'm just going to go back quickly. Whereas this one, whoops, hello. Ah, crap. No. Why are you going forward instead of backward, you silly thing? Okay, so while this one is, they're coming at from a place of like meanness and cruelty, they're just insulting each other without any real subtext underneath. With here, it's the same type of thing. He's tapping his staff, but in this world, mages have a tendency to go insane, and so she is concerned. And instead of it coming from a place of nastiness, it's coming from a place of genuine fondness and respect and friendship, and he understands that. So there's a lot more subtext there underneath. There's underneath a little bit of snark. There's a meaning behind it, and that fleshed out the characters and so on. And so I spent several months of pre-production just writing these conversations. I wrote dozens and dozens of them for every character pairing. And I really learned a lot about these characters just by having them talk to each other. If you play the game, you'll see a large chunk of them in the final product. And here's one that I'm particularly fond of, so I'm gonna show it to you. How do I play it? Here we go.
I still think it's crazy you carry a sword of all things.
I admit it is not very modern, but it has served me well for centuries.
You never thought of upgrading to something more long range?
Like your pistol? No. Such a weapon is too unpredictable.
Not if you know what you're doing.
Perhaps one day you can teach me.
Sure, but only if you let me swing that sword around.
One does not swing it around, but I agree to your terms.
It's a date then.
So you can practically smell where I almost veered into snark there. It's very tempting. It's so easy to go there. And, but instead I decided to make it about the characters understanding and appreciating each other. And so the theory is that over the course of the game, you see more and more of these conversations playing in the background. You see these characters coming together bit by bit, getting that mutual understanding, bonding as a group. And so by the end, these characters are really connected as a team, and because they all understand and get each other. And since you observed that, and in some cases were a participant in that, you feel that as well. So that was my goal there. Oh, come on. Sorry. So knowing my characters is all well and good. Hooray, I know who these characters are. But at the end of the day, it's still a game. Having somewhat good characters does not necessarily make them good game characters. So I made sure to approach these characters from both a high and low level perspective. I still wanted them to be fun game characters. So by high level, I mean the overall feel, the characters' personalities, their backstories, the filter that they kind of see the world through. Mandana here, for example, is who we saw before in the video, is a Jinn swordswoman who is several centuries old. She sees the world through a filter of what used to be there. She will look at a street corner and remember a tree she used to climb 200 years ago, or what supernatural creatures existed that do not anymore. So she sees the magic in the mundane. This guy, his name is Eli. He is a mage who came into his power very late in life. He can control fire. He had to leave his career and family behind. He is kind of bookish and nebbishy. He tends to look at the world through what he's lost and what he used to be. Logan here is a spirit medium, much like Rosa was in the Blackwell games, not a coincidence. He can talk to ghosts. He is also a recovering addict, and he tends to look at everything in relation to how it can help or hurt his recovery. Vicky Santina, who we also saw before, is a disgraced police officer from a large cop family. She typically divides the world into law-abiders and criminals, and she is the most mundane of the group. She has no special powers except that she's really good with a gun. And I'm obviously paraphrasing these characters, but these are the experiences and point of views that each character brings to the various conversations and interactions they have with you and various NPCs and each other. And I wanted to make you feel like you were hanging out with friends and getting to know them. So that's all high-level stuff. So if high-level means the overall feeling that I wanted you to have with each of these characters, low-level design means the steps that we take in order to achieve that feeling. the nitty-gritty details. What do these characters actually do from a gameplay perspective? How do they help you solve problems? And how do they help you progress through the game? And above all, how do these small details tie in and reinforce the high-level parts of their design? I knew that every mission would play out slightly differently depending on who you brought with you, and each character needed to bring something to the table. So going back to Mandana, she's very agile and can climb up to places that none of the other characters can get to, like this ledge. And her high-level goal, remember, her high-level design was that she knows all the hidden secrets in the mundane world. And this mechanic reinforces that because she can literally get to places that the average person can't. So they reinforce each other. Eli obviously can burn stuff, and he has a power called fire reading, which enables him to read anything that was consumed by fire. This is something he uses a lot in the game, and this reinforces a lot of his high-level design because he's a researcher at heart and a bit of a bookworm. So the fact that he uses this ultimate destructive power to read books is the most Eli thing imaginable. I just love that. Vicky, being a former cop, knows every police officer in the city, so she's able to get information from them that you would not get otherwise. And this ties to the idea that Vicky is closer to the mundane world than the rest of the group. The ability to just talk to people normally is kind of beyond everyone else in the group. So she's the one who kind of grounds everyone and connects them to like the real world. And Logan, being a spirit medium, can talk to ghosts. If you see a ghost in any scene, he can talk to that ghost, and you can get more information about what's going on in the area. He often uses his experiences as a recovering addict to connect to the ghosts and help them move on. And of all the high and low level connections, I feel his is maybe the most tenuous. I didn't quite get him to where I wanted him to be. But, you know, live and learn. If I do a sequel, I'll try to do better next time. So my intent here was for these two tiers, the high and low level design, to work together in tandem to make every character combination unique and fun and interesting. And at the same time, I also wanted you to see the potential alternate paths that you could have taken. If you didn't bring Vicky along to this place, for example, and you see this police officer, you might think, oh man, if I had Vicky, I could talk to that cop. She'd be willing to talk to me. And overall, I think I did a good job with this. Not every player loved every character, but there were no characters that were universally loved or universally hated. And the game was very specifically designed so that you could pick and choose for your favorites. So if you see this high ledge and Mandana's not there, you might wonder if she could have gone up there. The hope being that you'd want to replay the game or replay various scenes to see what would happen if you took another character combination. Theoretically, what I did not expect was that when the players saw a ghost and didn't have Logan, they got very frustrated and annoyed. And I found this very interesting because no one complained if they saw a high ledge and didn't have Mandana, or if they saw a cop and didn't have Vicky. They wondered what would happen, but they didn't regret their choices. But they really wanted to talk to that ghost because ghosts are inherently more interesting. You wonder who they are and what you're doing there. It feels like content that you're being locked out of instead of content that you're prevented from going to. It seems, there was a subtle distinction, but it was there. And as a result, they'd inevitably bring Logan with them on pretty much every mission thereafter. So the end result was that Logan was the most chosen character of them all, so, you know, you're welcome, Logan. Did anyone else do that same thing here? Show of hands? Okay, yeah, a few of you. Yeah, you're not alone. Design fail. So Unavowed is a game I'm very happy with, and wow, this went a lot shorter than I thought it would, but more time for Q&A. It's a game I'm very, very happy with. It's the game I've always wanted to make. It's broken all records financially and critically, so that's great. It was also nominated for an IGF award, which is something I never get tired of saying. It's been out for almost a year, though, and now I'm back in that place again, where I got to think of something new and get to that place all over again. So will I do it the same way? I don't know. I guess we'll see. Hopefully, Andrew will invite me again next year, and I can tell you about it then. But in the meantime, thank you very much. And so this went way shorter than I thought it would. I'm sorry for that, but please ask questions. Please, please, please ask questions. Yes? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if I knew the answer, then like we'd all be rich. I think I just figured it out. As I said, I got to a point where like I found what made these characters more interesting, or what made them tick, and what made them. I was able to lighten them up and have fun with them because I knew who they were. I kind of knew like what pushed Rosa and Joey's buttons. I kind of knew like Rosa was very closed off and kind of bitter in some cases because she has this ability that she can't tell anyone about. It's this thing she's very proud of, and it's a source of frustration for her, and kind of like results in some of the more like comedic interactions when you know that. But in the first game, I didn't know that. I kind of realized that over time, and I just got to a place where the characters were a lot more engaging than they were in the first game, and then those who stuck around felt that as well. And then they got invested and they kept going. I don't know how I would change that. I probably won't do another episodic series like that for a while. I like doing like the one-time thing because then I can just get it all in there. On a personal level, it was nice because I really got to know these characters and got very close to them. And it was kind of nice. I compare Rosa and Joey to like old friends I've known very intimately since I was very young, while the Unavowed characters were people that I just met, and I think they're really cool. I'm still in the process of getting to know them. So as what the secret is, I got no idea. I kind of actually did that. The second game is technically a prequel, but you wouldn't normally play them in that order. It's just like another story that takes place with one of Rosa's ancestors and kind of like showing her story. There's a long, complicated reason why I did that. Though I don't know. I mean, if you do a prequel, then you have to remarket the whole thing as the game starts here, and that is difficult. Yeah, and then when they get to that weaker game, they still might bounce off of it. I don't know, because it still exists. You can't just get rid of it. Yeah, but then the thing is, like I said, no matter, even though the last Blackwell game is the most recent one, they're not going to start with the last one. They're going to start with the first one, and I'm very hard on the game. Is Emily Short here? Emily Short? Yeah, we once had this fun conversation where I gave a talk about Blackwell and I kind of talked about how bad it was. And she came up to me and she's like, no, it's really, really good. I liked it. And I'm like, no, it's really bad. It has all these awful things. And it was this weird reversal where I was like downplaying my own game. I'm very hard on it, but I do stand by it at the same time. I was very new as a developer. It was probably the best I could have done with the resources, time, and experience that I had at that stage in my career. So I stand by it. It's just I can do so much better now. And the fact that any future game I did was still tied to that first one was always going to be a problem, no matter how good any future game was, even if it was a prequel. So that's... very much so, because I would often, when I didn't know what my next Blackwell game would be, I would often think, okay, Rosa and Joey, I knew it would be snowing. They're on a city street, it's snowing, let's have them have a conversation. And since I knew them so well, I could just write, and it ended up in the game. So I thought I would apply that to characters I didn't know and see if I could do the same thing and get to know them that way. And like I said, often like the stuff about the history of mages and how they work, I sort of figured that out based on that dialogue between Eli and Mandana, where, why are you scratching your fingernail? Why are you scratching your buttons? And like, okay, why? Why is he scratching his buttons? And that all kind of expanded out into really learning about the characters. So that helped me out a lot. there's only so far it can go until you like set them loose in the game world and actually have them do things. You know, no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy and all that. There's only so far it can go. There are no real shortcuts. And I did, like, by the end of production, go back and re-edit a lot of their lines as I got to know them a little better. Especially once, like, I knew who was voice acting the characters. That helps a lot in helping. Once I literally can hear their voice, it's like, that's what they would say. Like, that's always the lightning moment for me. Does that answer your question? Okay. Anybody else? Yeah, we have a lot of time, so please. Yes. If you play the Shiva looking for like instructions on how to be Jewish, like I really would recommend not doing that. It's not very accurate. I got a lot of things wrong. The rabbi has no control over the synagogue, as anyone Jewish here would know. So, I mean, yes and no. Shiva was a very personal game for me. It was also very short and a very very short personal thing. I don't know if I could sustain that over a longer game. There's no ruling it out. I mean, since I'm dealing with like ghosts and afterlife in a lot of my stories, there is an element of that. But I'm not a very religious person, so I don't really think about it. But I wouldn't not do it. It's not so much that I've gotten feedback from others. I just know how I feel when I'm playing a game, and the game is asking me to do all these things, and I have no interest in it, or I don't care, or worse, I don't even know why I'm doing it, and I don't want to do that in my own work. I play a game, and I'm like, why should I care about this? Why am I helping this person? This person's a jerk. Or why does this character even care? I don't even know. And I think about that a lot in my own work. It's like, all right, where's the audience? I always think of where's the audience engagement. There's this wonderful book by Russell T. Davies, who wrote the David Tennant era of Doctor Who. He talks about how he wanted to end David Tennant's tenure of being the Doctor. Spoiler: David Tennant stops being the Doctor after a while. And I'm not going to spoil it, but he says he originally wrote it that he sacrifices himself for this complete stranger, which is a very David Tennant Doctor way of going. But as a fan, as someone who loves this character and loves the show, he was not emotionally invested in that. He felt very cheated because, like, why is this character I love sacrificing himself for someone I don't care about? And so he changed it so he sacrifices himself for someone we do care about. And those of you who have seen it know how really emotionally affecting it is. And when I read that, I'm like, he is so right. He's always trying to think of where the audience's mind is, and he treats it like a fan as well. And I always treat it like, as a fan of these games, like, do I even care? Where's the emotional investment here? And if I care about the characters, I develop a very good instinct for where that emotional investment actually is. Is Francisco Gonzalez here? How would you answer that question?
Yes. Dave's very good about, Dave will play the games obviously multiple times when he's working with other developers, and he'll make notes and he'll say, well, I mean, that's valuable player feedback because Dave is the player. So he's saying, I didn't really connect with this character for reason X, maybe you should think about doing this. So yeah, he provides guidance to his...
It also helps that I am not the writer of the game. So when I am working with a developer like Francisco or like James or anyone else, I can play it and approach it from a player perspective, because I'm not as deeply entrenched in the weeds as the developer would be. So I can, if I'm not connecting with the character, I can try to figure out why and have that level of distance. It's harder to do that with my own work. So yeah, that's what I do. There's no way to quantify it. Sometimes there's a moment where you're like, yeah, that's it. There was this one moment, I think it was the third Blackwell game. It was a stupid line where Rosa talks about something and Joey is like, you find that interesting? She's like, yes, I find that interesting. And he's like, you find documentaries about squirrels interesting? And she replies, well, they are. And it's such a stupid little thing. It's not even that funny. But when I wrote that, I'm like, that is a Rosa thing to say. And then I'm like, oh my God, I know what a Rosa thing to say is. And it was like this magical moment, like, yeah, that's it. And when that happens, that's like I said, that's the juice. That's why you get into it, for those moments. And like I live for that. When I finally get there and I know the characters, like there's no feeling like it. I think my main issue with that first Blackwell game was that it was my very first commercial game. And that was the core of it. If I had made it later, if I made it now, it would probably be much better. And yeah, that's a totally valid way of doing it. There's no right or wrong way to do an episodic series. It's like, if it works, yay. If it doesn't, boo. The main problem with episodic games most of the time is that I used to say the only one you could trust was Telltale. Because when you hear, oh, it's an episodic series, the first thing I think is, okay, come back to me when all the games are out. Or maybe they'll get to the end if they, don't run out of money or don't get bored or whatever. And I used to think that Telltale was the only one you would trust to finish a series. That has sadly changed. So like the trust just isn't there yet for a lot of episodic games, and that was part of the problem as well. Not only was the first Blackwell game very weak, it was a struggle to get people to play the next one because the trust just wasn't there. Now things are different. I sell it all as one pack, and it's basically like one big game instead of 5 games. So it's a little different. But yeah, there's no right or wrong way to do it. I just, at the moment, would prefer not to. That's the challenge. That's always been the challenge for me, because like I said, they hear about, Blackwell Epiphany was reviewed very well, and had a lot of really positive buzz on social media. And the sales of #1 shot up. They didn't shoot up like throughout the rest of the series though, because they played the first one and they bounced off of it because it has issues. It's an old game. It was my first one. I do think that it's harder now than it was back when I first started. There's so much now. It is kind of overwhelming. I don't think I could sell Blackwell Legacy, the first Blackwell game, now. When I started in 2006, there was not a lot out there in terms of, not just in terms of indie adventure games, but of adventure games as a whole, or indie games as a whole. There was not much out there. And so I was able to people were willing to try it because there was not much else. And so people did manage to stick with it. Now, it's a lot harder because there's just so much stuff. There's so much to consume that if you don't like it, why would you continue it when there's like 10 other things over here that are better? I don't have an answer. Any frame of reference I have is like 13 years out of date. So I don't know. I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm trying to think. There's been like several. Okay, the second Blackwell game. I said before there was a reason why I made it a prequel. The reason why is because originally games 2 and 3 were going to be one game, and within that game there was some flashbacks to Rosa's ancestor, and I decided the game was getting a little too unwieldy, so I cut those flashbacks. And then, oh no, I'm out of money. I need to make something really cheap. So I had those flashbacks already written, so I made a game out of them, and that was Blackwell Unbound. And so I basically pulled this game out of my butt. I made it in 4 months for like $1,000, and for some reason, it is the fan favorite. Everyone loves the main character in that game. Her name is Lauren. Everyone loves it, even though it looks cheap, it plays cheap, like everything about it is so much cheaper. But people resonated with this character so well, it was totally unexpected. So I don't know if there's a lesson in there. What it is, I don't quite know what it is, but it has happened for sure. Yeah, kinda. When I first started, well, now I feel like there's a much bigger eye on me, no pun intended. 'Cause like, I love this guy. Also that my company is much bigger. We have a bigger audience now, so it's more like there's this sounds so pretentious, and I'm really sorry, the burden of expectations is a lot higher than it used to be. So I'm often a lot more careful and take a lot more time on what I do than I did like 13 years ago. Because yeah, now that there's so much out there, and like every year there's like thousands of new game developer students all wanting to go indie. They're not looking to join a company, they're all looking to go indie. So like every year there's like a fresh crop of like new people, all struggling to be heard, all wanting their games to sell and everything. So there's just so much. So it's like I put a lot more effort in than I used to, which is why in 2006 it took maybe 4 to 6 months to get a game out. Now it's a few years because like I want it to be, I have higher standards, I guess. My pretentious answer when people ask me, so who's your audience? I say myself, because it's like there are easier ways to earn a living. And if I'm not happy with what I'm doing, then why am I doing it? So it's funny you say, like, how do you handle critiques of puzzles or whatever? The main critique of a lot of my games, the ones that I've written, are that they're too easy. I don't put a lot of puzzles in my games. I'm not very good at them. Instead, I find that like back in the 80s when I played King's Quest III, I spent like 3 months trying to figure out how to defeat that stupid wizard. And I was happy to do it. Now I would last like 5 minutes, maybe tops. And that is a thing that exists now. Like you're only stuck if you want to be. And I feel like if you have to leave my game to enjoy it, like go to a walkthrough or whatever, then I failed as a designer. So what a lot of new modern developers understand this. And instead they put their efforts into other areas like immersion and interactivity and things like that. Life is Strange did this very, very well, where you walk into someone's room and you have like all their pictures and documents on the wall, and you just snoop around and look at stuff. And Gone Home did this as well. And by the time you finish, like you really get an understanding of who this person is, because you are the one discovering the information. So they're not puzzles per se, but they are like, it's immersion. That's what a lot of more modern games are focused on, because they know you don't have to get stuck. They know you're not really gonna get stuck because Google is just right there. So a lot of modern developers do focus more on the immersion factor. And I know that I tend to prefer those types of games myself. So how do I approach both camps? I don't. I mean, the same thing. I mean, it's not that you shouldn't put as much effort into the NPCs, it's just that it's a lot of wasted effort. You definitely don't want to have someone too generic. I don't know, there's no rhyme or reason really. What I always try to focus on when I have a character talking to an NPC is have it relate back to the player character in some way, because that, again, that's where your emotional investment is. So if the NPC, has like a belief or something that it's for or against something that the character believes, then there's some conflict there or what have you. That's just a quick example off the top of my head, but I often bring it back to the character that I care about in some way or form. That's what I do. Well, aside from, there was one character that ended up being completely different. The mage character, the sketch had like a wand and like a top hat, and he was like flourishy, and then like the actual character, he's like, a nebbish on an overcoat and like skinny tie, he looks like business John Constantine. So, yeah. It's not something I've done before. It's something I decided to do this time because I wanted to be able to visualize the characters. I have some kind of visual reference when I was writing them. And I thought it would help. And it did. So I'd probably do it again. But that's just, there's no like hard or fast rules for this. So that's just what worked for me. It might not work for you. And I think we are over our time. So thank you all so much. This was great.